Hey guys, today we're going to continue our discussion of deviance, and we're going to specifically discuss the roles of deviance in a cultural group or in society. So first, just to review, deviance is any action or idea that deviates or goes against the norms in a culture or in a group. So any social norms, societal norms, if those are broken, that's deviance. And there are some roles of deviance. And one of the first roles of deviance is to help to define group boundaries. So it helps kind of by showing what isn't. It's like the negative side. It shows what isn't a part of the set of rules that the group is governed by or that the group operates according to. By showing what isn't a part of that, it helps to establish what is a part of that. So these don't have to be written or official rules because a lot of times groups operate, especially smaller groups or a lot of social groups operate under unwritten rules or just assumed rules, right? So you assume that you should be courteous when you're out and about, right? And you assume what you think is courteous, but different cultures have a standard for what is courteous, right? But we operate according to what the unwritten rule of being courteous is. So deviance helps a group to make a set of rules or to define what those rules should be. So if we're talking about being courteous, right, seeing someone not being courteous or breaking those rules, being deviant as far as being courteous is concerned, helps people to understand what courteous is. So it helps to define those rules. Deviance can show what is not acceptable in a group. Like, is being direct okay? And what level of being direct constitutes not being courteous anymore or being discourteous? So it's helping to find that boundary of where the line is between being courteous and being discourteous. So also, just to give you examples of deviance and punishment to reinforce norms. If the deviance goes too far, then punishments are put into place or enacted to stop the deviance and to show other people that that level of deviance was too far. Okay, so for example, if you're speeding, that's a norm. Now we'll talk about a lot of people don't follow the speed limit, right? But I'm just using a general example of there's a line of deviance too far outside of the set speed limit where most people would expect if that person is pulled over, they are going to be punished to show that that is an unsafe or unacceptable level of deviance from the cultural norm or the social norm. So if someone's going 35 over, right, you're not going to find too many people that are going to say, oh, they shouldn't be punished for that, right? Most people are going to say, well, that's a ridiculous amount of speed, therefore it's too far from the social norm. Punishment should be enacted, or it's okay if punishment is enacted. You know, if someone's going 15 over, the law states that that person can be punished for speeding if they're caught. Now, if someone's going 1 over, you may get some wiggle room and say, well, that's slight deviance, and it may just be error. It may not be intentional deviance. That's not enough a lot of times for people to be punished. But speeding would be an example, especially excessive speeding would be an example of deviance from the norm or the expected norm and punishment to reinforce that norm. In a workplace, maybe if an employee is habitually late and they're not following the employee handbook for report time, they may get written up or they may receive some kind of punishment for deviance from the expected norm at that group. That group norm is report on time, and therefore when they deviate from that, they may be punished. And that punishment may be to show everyone else, this is the report time, and if you don't report on time, therefore you will be punished. So report on time. And again, even with unwritten rules, like not even just in a corporate setting or a business setting, but for social gatherings, there's an acceptable window of lateness, right? Like I personally, I strive very hard to show up early, not just on time, but a little bit early to everything that is, whether it's a social gathering, if it's a work, whatever it is, I try to show up early, not just on time. Uh, and I feel that being late, especially if one is excessively late, is not good. And so for me in my social groups, if someone's habitually late to social gatherings with me, I may either set an earlier arrival time for them, or I may choose to associate less with that person if they're late habitually. Because an unwritten rule for me is promptness, and an unwritten rule for a lot of people is promptness, right? So that would be deviance from people in my group setting, the expected norms. Deviance would be being late habitually, and then corrective measure may be talking to the person. It may be setting an earlier time, like if you're supposed to meet at 6 and they're habitually 15 minutes late, ask them to be there at 5:45, right? Or it could be associating with them less, whatever those are. But deviance helps define boundaries. So that's the first role of deviance. It helps the group establish what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and by means of a demonstration of what's gone too far past the line so that that line can be set. Okay, also, deviance can help create social solidarity. That's the second role. The first role is it helps a group define boundaries. Second is it creates social solidarity. Seeing deviance can reinforce conformity. And conformity, by the way, it has a negative connotation these days, but conformity can be very important. Just think of conformity as far as driving laws. Driving on the right side of the road in the United States. If there's not conformity to that, if someone's just like, oh, I'm going to deviate, I'm nonconformist, I'm countercultural, I'm just going to drive on the left. Well, first of all, if one person does it, it can cause an accident, it can cause traffic. It's not safe, right? So conformity to that rule, that social expectation or that social norm is very important. And if a lot of people start driving on the wrong side of the road in America, that can create havoc. So conformity can be important. Another thing would be paying bills on time. If people just decide they're going to be countercultural and they're just going to work on their own schedule and not pay their bills, or just pay their bills whenever they feel like it, just imagine if 20 million people started doing that in America, or 20 million more people started doing that in America, the economic ramifications or implications that would occur by this idea of deviance from an expected social norm. So deviance can create conformity or social solidarity because people can see the effects when someone deviates, and therefore they can help to reinforce the social or cultural norm. Seeing the negative effects of deviance can help establish solidarity. But deviance, again, can serve a positive function, because sometimes solidarity can be a negative thing. It can be solidarity for the wrong thing, right? So an example would be Galileo and Copernicus with geocentric view of the world versus a heliocentric view of the world, right? So culture had established in this pre-1600s that the Earth was the center of the universe. All right, so that'd be geocentric. And any idea that challenged that could lead to censure from the church and actual imprisonment, punishment, shunning. Lots of different punishments could occur from challenging that traditionalism, even though that tradition was wrong, right? Science has shown that the heliocentric view is actually accurate, that the sun is the center of the solar system. So that conformity can be negative, but it can also be positive. And deviance can show the need for solidarity or conformity when appropriate. But the third thing that deviance does is it provides innovation. So this would be kind of challenging outdated or unnecessary social norms or cultural norms. By the way, sometimes deviance challenges necessary social norms and changes them, and that can have a negative impact. But we're not going to touch on that too much because that can get very complex very fast. But deviance can be needed at times, and deviance can challenge outdated social norms or help innovation. A great example would be the Wright brothers. Okay, the Wright brothers had a lot of pushback socially and culturally for their push to have aviation. A lot of people were resistant to the idea of aviation and people being in airplanes. But the Wright brothers continued with their social deviance and their cultural deviance, and because of that, we're reaping a host of benefits today. Another great example would be the civil rights movement, right? So deviance from the expected cultural social norm, which was segregation, was a good thing. Deviance from that was great because deviating from that through things like sit-ins, for example, or marches or protests, deviance from the expected social or cultural norm in America challenged a very bad doctrine of segregation, right? So racial inequality was challenged and progress was made for minorities because of deviance. So deviance can serve a positive role in society at times. But anytime there's deviance, it usually serves one of those three roles or fills one of those three functions that we talked about. The one we just talked about was innovation or change, right? We talked about creating solidarity, which can be very important for some things like driving on the right side of the road, right? And it helps a group define boundaries. So there are both positive and negative roles of deviance. And deviance serves good functions in society at times, but deviance can also change established norms that are positive and serve a negative role. So what I want you to see today about deviance is that it serves those three roles generally in a society, and that deviance can have some benefits to a society, but deviance can also create negative impacts or negative implications in a society as well. So deviance isn't just, usually when we hear deviance, we think of it as a bad thing, right? But deviance can be good, it can be bad. It just kind of is what it is. If you have any questions on today's lesson, or if you want to unpack it, or if you want to continue the discussion a little more, feel free to shoot me an email. I'd love to continue the discussion. But what I want you to see today is that there are functions served by deviance in our culture. Some are good, some are bad. And that's it for today. So if you have any further questions, shoot me an email. If you want to continue the discussion, I'd love to do that. All right, have a great day, guys.